The morning Pearl Langley arrived at the Caldwell County Courthouse with her father's deed folded inside her coat. She had no idea that a stranger's quiet act of defiance would change the entire course of her life. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Harrowfield, Texas, sat perched on the edge of a dry and restless plain where the wind came in hard from the northwest and smelled of red clay and distant rain. Harrowfield was not a beautiful town, but it was a living one full of the particular kind of ambition that takes root in a place where water is scarce and land is everything. There were 3 saloons, a general store owned by a man named Fletcher who priced things according to his mood, a livery stable with a broken weather vane shaped like a rooster, and a courthouse that doubled as a meeting hall whenever the county needed to gather its men and talk about the things that men in 1878 talked about, which was primarily land. Land was the whole conversation in Harrowfield that fall. The state of Texas had opened up a new stretch of territory to the southeast, a broad expanse of rolling grassland threaded with small creeks and sheltered from the worst winds by a natural ridge of limestone. Every rancher within 50 miles had spent the summer calculating how many acres they could stake, what the grass would carry in terms of cattle, and whether the water rights were attached or would have to be purchased separately from the county clerk. It was the kind of land that made men dream a little bigger than was wise. Pearl Langley was 24 years old. With dark brown hair she wore in a practical braid that fell down the center of her back, and eyes the color of creek water after a storm, somewhere between gray and green, depending on the light and her mood that morning was determined. She had ridden the 8 miles from the Langley homestead herself, on a chestnut mare named Biscuit that had more opinions than most people Pearl knew, and she had dressed in her better blouse and her father's old hat because it made her feel like he was with her, and she needed that. Her father, Robert Langley, had died 4 months earlier from a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it before anyone had a chance to say a proper goodbye. He had left Pearl the deed to 240 acres of good grassland, a herd of 63 longhorns, a well that worked most of the time, and a set of records written in his careful hand that documented every water right, every boundary survey, and every gentleman's agreement he had ever made with the neighboring ranchers. What he had not left her was anyone to help her hold it. Her mother had passed when Pearl was 12. She had no brothers. She had no husband, because she had not yet found a man whose company she preferred to her own, which was a fact that the women of Harrowfield regarded as a mild tragedy, and the men of Harrowfield regarded as a mild challenge. Neither interpretation had ever moved Pearl particularly. She tied Biscuit to the post outside the courthouse and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the door with her deed in her coat and her father's hat on her head and her chin at an angle that communicated, to anyone who understood such signals, that she was not interested in being stopped. The man at the door stopped her anyway. His name was Gerald Holt, and he worked for the county in some capacity that was never entirely clear, but seemed to involve standing in doorways and deciding who could pass through them. He was a wide man with a thin mustache and the careful smile of someone who enjoyed delivering disappointing news. "Meetings for landowners," he said. "I am a landowner," Pearl said. "Meetings for landowners in good standing with the county," he said, and his smile got a fraction wider, which made it worse. "My land is in perfectly good standing. That deed is under your father's name, Robert Langley." Gerald Holt nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Robert Langley is deceased, and I am his heir. That is settled in law." "That is settled eventually in law," Holt said. "The probate process takes time, Miss Langley. Until the county formally transfers the title, that land is technically in a kind of limbo, and the county meeting is for landowners, not for individuals awaiting adjudication of an estate." Pearl looked at him steadily. She had anticipated resistance, because Harrowfield was a place where resistance to women acting alone was a form of local weather, as common and predictable as the northwest wind. But she had not anticipated this particular argument, which was technically crafted and practically infuriating. "The meeting concerns water rights for the new territory," she said. "Those rights, once assigned, will be permanent. My land borders the East Creek tributary that feeds directly into the new parcel. If those rights are assigned without my participation, I will have no legal recourse." "That does sound like a problem," Holt said, in the tone of a man describing someone else's problem from a comfortable distance. Pearl pressed her lips together. She was aware of the men behind her now, other ranchers and landowners filing past her on either side, some of them not looking at her, and some of them looking at her with the particular sympathy that means no one intends to help. She recognized Jim Drury from the Triple Creek Ranch, who nodded at her in a way that was apologetic without being useful. She recognized old Marcus Webb, who had been her father's friend and who looked briefly pained before going inside. She stood on the top step with her deed and her father's hat and the morning sun coming in at a low angle that made the courthouse look almost noble, and she thought about what her father had written in his records. He had a phrase he used at the top of certain pages when he was noting something important. He wrote, "This must be protected." 240 acres of grass and a herd of 63 longhorns and a well that worked most of the time. This must be protected. She was still standing there, working through her options, when the door opened from the inside and a man came out. She did not know him, which was itself notable, because Pearl knew most people in Harrowfield at least by sight. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of lean and angular build that came from long days of physical work rather than any particular design. He had dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that had not met a razor in 3 or 4 days. And he was wearing a shirt that was clean, but had been ironed by someone who was enthusiastic rather than skilled. He carried himself with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never found it necessary to prove anything to anyone, which Pearl thought was either very admirable or very annoying, and she hadn't decided which yet. He stepped out onto the top step and looked at Gerald Holt, and then he looked at Pearl, and then he looked back at Holt with a very specific expression that Pearl had not seen on a man's face in this context before. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "What is happening here?" he asked. His voice was quiet and level, which somehow made it carry better than if he had been loud. "Meetings for landowners," Holt said, with less confidence than the first time. "This woman is a landowner," the man said. "Her title is currently under adjudication. I just came from inside that room," the man said, "where I heard Ned Cassidy present a deed he bought off a man who owed him money, and the county clerk accepted it without question. He has held that deed for 3 months. Probate in this county takes 4 months minimum, so either Ned Cassidy is also awaiting adjudication, or the rule is being applied selectively." Gerald Holt opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "My name is Daniel Easton," the man said to Pearl. He said it without drama, like it was simply information she might find useful. "I have a parcel of 300 acres on the western side of the new territory. I came to this meeting because the creek tributary that runs along my western fence line feeds into the same system as the East Creek. Your land and mine are connected by water." Pearl looked at him. "Pearl Langley. My father owned the Langley homestead east of town." Something shifted in his expression just slightly. "Robert Langley," he said. "You knew him." "He helped me navigate the water easement process when I first arrived, 2 years ago. He was a decent man." Pearl felt the weight of that settle in her chest the way grief sometimes did, not as a blow but as a pressure, quiet and persistent. "He was," she said. Daniel Easton turned back to Gerald Holt. "I am going back inside," he said, "and Miss Langley is coming with me. If you have a legal objection that is grounded in actual county statute rather than improvised policy, write it down and present it to the county clerk after the meeting. Otherwise, step aside." Holt looked at Easton. Then he looked at Pearl. Then he looked at the gathering of men who had paused on the steps to watch, because a quiet confrontation in the Wild West carries the same gravitational pull as a loud one, and he stepped aside. Daniel Easton held the door open and said nothing further, because nothing further was needed. Pearl walked through the door with her deed and her father's hat, and the particular feeling of walking into a room where you have just been told you do not belong, which is a feeling that sharpens the mind considerably. The meeting room was full of wooden chairs arranged in rough rows, and a table at the front where 3 men sat with papers and a ledger. The air smelled of pipe tobacco and sawdust and coffee that had been sitting too long. Every head in the room turned when Pearl entered, and there was a brief, rustling silence of the kind that precedes either trouble or the acceptance of something new. Pearl walked to a chair in the second row, sat down, placed her deed on her knee, and looked at the men at the front table with an expression that communicated she was ready to proceed. Daniel Easton sat down in the chair beside her. She noticed it, the choice of that specific chair when there were many others available, but she did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the table at the front and she listened, and when it was time to speak about the East Creek tributary, she spoke clearly and with the documentation her father had left her, and she did not allow anyone to interrupt her until she was finished. The meeting was 3 hours long. It was contentious in the way that all meetings about water and land in 1878 were contentious, because water and land were the same as survival, and survival made people argumentative. There were moments when voices rose and men pushed their chairs back with aggressive scraping sounds, and there were moments of near consensus that collapsed when someone discovered a detail that changed the arithmetic. Pearl held her position throughout. She knew the documents. She knew the legal language because her father had taught her to read the county statutes before she was 15, had sat with her at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread between them and said, "A woman who knows the law is harder to cheat than a woman who doesn't." She used that knowledge now, quietly and precisely, and she watched the men at the front table begin to treat her contributions as legitimate in the way that people sometimes shift their positions, not because they have been convinced, but because the alternative has become too publicly difficult. When the meeting ended, the water rights for the East Creek tributary were provisionally assigned to both the Langley homestead and to Daniel Easton's western parcel, with a shared easement along the connecting stretch, pending the formal completion of Pearl's probate. It was a partial victory. The provisional nature meant it could still be contested, but it was more than she had expected to leave with. She stood outside on the courthouse steps in the thinning morning, and the sunlight was warmer now, past the early chill, and she was aware of the complex arithmetic of gratitude and independence that was running through her mind. She was grateful. She was also conscious of how much she disliked needing to be grateful. Daniel Easton came out behind her and stood beside her on the steps, looking out across the main street of Harrowfield with its hitching posts and its dust and its particular weekday energy of commerce and gossip. "Thank you," Pearl said. She said it directly, because directness was something she had learned from her father and kept like a good tool. "You would have found a way in without me," he said. "Possibly, but you shortened it." "Gerald Holt is going to make the next 6 months difficult," Daniel said. "He doesn't like being outmaneuvered in front of people." "Gerald Holt was going to make the next 6 months difficult regardless," Pearl said. "He has never approved of a woman running a ranch alone, and he has never approved of my father not selling to the Cassidy family when he had the chance. The Cassidys own Gerald Holt in the same way that some men own a dog. You point them in a direction and they go." Daniel looked at her. She could feel it rather than see it, the quality of attention he was paying. "You've been dealing with this for a while," he said. "Since my father died, 4 months." She looked at the street. "Before that, they just dealt with him, and he was better at ignoring them than I am." "You don't look like you're doing badly at it." "I look determined. That is not the same as not being tired." There was a small silence, not uncomfortable. A horse went by on the street, ridden by a boy who was moving too fast and knew it and didn't care. "I need to get back to my herd," Pearl said. 63 Longhorns don't manage themselves. She gathered her coat, checked that the deed was still safely inside, and started down the steps. "Miss Langley," Daniel said. She stopped and looked back at him. "The shared easement means we're going to be dealing with the same water issues for the foreseeable future," he said. "It might be useful to look at the creek line together before the winter survey. See if there's anything that needs to be recorded before the county comes out." Pearl considered this. It was a reasonable suggestion, framed in perfectly practical terms, which she appreciated. She was also aware that she did not entirely know this man, and that reasonable suggestions from unfamiliar men were not always purely practical. "Monday morning," she said. "I'll meet you at the East Creek Fork at 8 o'clock. Bring whatever survey notes you have from when you established your western boundary." "I'll be there," he said. She walked down the steps and untied Biscuit from the post, and rode back across 8 miles of flat Texas plain with the west wind at her side, and the deed in her coat, and something new and uncharted sitting at the back of her thoughts, which she did not yet have a name for. The week before Monday was not an idle one. Pearl had a ranch to run, which meant mornings started before the sun and evenings ended after it, and the hours between were a continuous negotiation with animals and weather and machinery that was always one component away from failing. She moved the herd to the north pasture, where the grass was still holding, patched a section of fence on the east boundary that a bull named Congregation had decided to test with his considerable personality, and dealt with a problem with the well casing that required 3 hours on her back in the dirt before she understood what was wrong, and another 2 hours after that before she had fixed it. She also spent an afternoon in her father's office, which was a small room off the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and a particular kind of masculine tidiness. Everything filed and labeled, nothing wasted. She went through his water rights documentation carefully, looking for anything that related to the creek easement, and also, she told herself, simply refreshing her memory of the legal details, that she found herself reading certain passages twice and thinking about a man with dark hair who needed a haircut was not something she paused to examine closely. On Sunday evening, her nearest neighbor, a widow named Agnes Colville, who had survived 3 decades on the Texas plain through a combination of stubbornness and practical genius, came over for supper and sat at Pearl's kitchen table and watched her with the patient expression of a woman who sees things. "You are thinking about something that isn't cattle," Agnes said. "I am always thinking about cattle," Pearl said. "You have a look," Agnes said. "Your mother had the same look on occasion. It is the look of a woman who has met someone she isn't sure what to do with." "I have met a great many people I wasn't sure what to do with," Pearl said, putting beans on the table. "Most of them are on the county board of supervisors." Agnes ate beans and was quiet for a while, which was one of the things Pearl genuinely loved about her, the ability to be quiet without filling the space with noise. Then she said, "I heard about the courthouse. What Easton did. Word travels." "Word always travels in Harrowfield. It's the only real entertainment we have." Agnes broke a piece of cornbread. "I knew his mother. She passed when he was young. He came out here from Tennessee 2 years ago, bought that western parcel, built his operation himself without asking much of anyone. He is considered reliable and fair by people who know him, which is harder to find than it sounds." "You're giving me a report," Pearl said. "I am giving you information," Agnes said. "What you do with it is entirely your business." Pearl looked out the kitchen window at the early dark coming down over her land and said nothing more, but she was listening. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the sky the particular hard blue of Texas autumn, and Pearl was at the East Creek Fork at 10 minutes to 8 on Biscuit, with her father's survey notes in a leather satchel and her better coat on because the mornings had teeth now. Daniel Easton was already there. He was standing at the creek bank looking at the water, which in early autumn was running low but honest, carrying its trickle of life through the dry grass with the quiet determination of something that has been doing this for longer than any living person can remember. He had his own papers rolled under his arm, and he was wearing a heavy canvas coat, and he had, she noted, found a razor since the courthouse. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early," he said. "It's a character flaw. Most people consider it a virtue. Most people haven't had to wait at creek banks in the cold because of it," he said, and the way he said it made her want to smile, which she managed to mostly suppress. They spent the next 2 hours walking the creek line, comparing their documents, noting where the survey stakes had shifted over the summer's erosion and where the water table had dropped. The work was absorbing in the way that all honest work is absorbing. It required full attention and produced real results, and had the quality of mattering, which Pearl had always found more satisfying than work that was merely performed. Daniel was good at it. He had the kind of methodical intelligence that her father had had: thorough, patient, willing to sit with a problem until it yielded rather than forcing a solution out of impatience. He also listened when she spoke, actually listened, not in the manner of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but in the manner of a man who understood that someone else might know something he didn't. She found this profoundly unusual and disarming and annoying in that order. "This section here," she said, pointing to a bend in the creek where the bank had cut back by several feet, "this was where my father's original stake was placed. The erosion has moved the effective water line almost 4 feet east. If the county surveys this winter and takes the current bank as the boundary, I lose access to the upstream catch." Daniel knelt and looked at the soil. "The original stake line would have been established when the creek was higher," he said. "Before the dry years. Your father's documentation, does he have anything that establishes the original flow rate?" "He has a weather journal. 15 years of rainfall measurements and creek observations." Pearl reached into her satchel and found the relevant pages, folded carefully. She handed them to him and watched him read them with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. "This is extraordinary documentation," he said. "My father was an extraordinary careful man," Pearl said. "He knew that a woman inheriting land alone would need evidence that could not be argued with." Daniel looked at her over the pages. "He planned for this. He planned for everything he could plan for," Pearl said. "He could not plan for dying at 51. She had not meant to say that last part aloud. It came out before she could hold it back, and she heard in her own voice the particular rawness of recent grief that she had spent 4 months trying to keep below the surface in public. Daniel handed the pages back to her carefully. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "Not in the way people say it without thinking, in the way of actually meaning it. He was a man worth keeping." Pearl folded the pages back into the satchel and looked at the creek for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she needed to move through the moment rather than dwell in it, she said, "The western boundary of your parcel, does it follow this ridge line or does it cut below it?" They worked through the rest of the morning in a rhythm that felt, to Pearl's slight surprise, entirely natural. There was none of the awkwardness she had expected from working alongside a man she had just met, none of the performative chivalry that made her feel managed rather than respected. He treated her as a working colleague, which was what she was, and the ease of that was so unexpected after 4 months of men treating her variously as a burden, a problem, an opportunity, or an object of misplaced protectiveness, that she found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't realized she had not been doing. By noon they had documented the full creek line and identified 3 points that would need to be flagged before the county survey. They sat on a flat rock above the creek bank and ate the food they had each brought. Pearl had bread and dried beef and an apple. Daniel had cornbread and a piece of smoked cheese that he divided and shared without making a point of it. And the conversation drifted, as it does when work has been done well, from practical to personal. "Tennessee," Pearl said. "What brought you to Texas?" Daniel looked at the creek. "I had a farm in Tennessee. It belonged to my family for 3 generations. After my father died, I kept it going for a few years, but it was the kind of land that was running down. The soil was tired and the neighbors were closing in, and the whole enterprise had the feeling of a thing that was coming to its end. He picked up a small stone and turned it in his hand. I sold it at a fair price, which was more than my father thought I'd get, and I came west because I wanted to start something rather than maintain something. And this parcel, Pearl said, is a start, he said. It will be something real in another 5 years if the water holds and the market stays reasonable. He looked at her. You have 63 longhorns and 240 acres. And a well that needs attention and a fence that a bull named Congregation has decided is optional, Pearl said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not the careful social laugh of a man trying to be charming, and it changed his face in a way that was worth looking at. Congregation, he said. My father named him. Said the bull had opinions about everything and refused to be moved once he'd made up his mind about something, which reminded him of a congregation. Your father named a bull after a church. My father named things according to their truest nature, Pearl said. It was one of his principles. She was smiling now, the particular kind of smile that belongs to a memory that still hurts but also still warms you. He named me Pearl because he said babies came into the world the same way pearls did, through a great deal of struggle and difficulty, and the end result was something beautiful that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That's a good father, he said softly. Yes, Pearl said. He was. They sat with that for a while, and the creek ran its patient trickle, and a hawk made a wide circle overhead against the hard blue sky, and Pearl thought that this was an unexpectedly good morning. The weeks that followed built on that Monday the way a proper structure builds on a solid foundation, each week adding something, each encounter adding a new dimension, each conversation going a little further into territory that neither of them entirely mapped in advance. They met 3 more times at the creek line, ostensibly for survey work, and the survey work did get done, but so did a great deal of talking. Pearl learned that Daniel had 2 horses, one sensible and one that he described as spiritually ambitious, that he could cook 3 things well and everything else adequately, that he had taught himself to read water tables from a book he had ordered by post from a surveyor in Austin, and that he had a dry humor that revealed itself slowly, like a country road that looks flat until you notice you've been climbing. He learned that she could ride as well as anyone in the county and better than most, that she had been running the ranch essentially alone since her father's health began to decline a year before his death, that she had opinions about everything and expressed them in complete sentences without apology, and that she made a noise of annoyance when she encountered bureaucratic obstruction that was somewhere between a word and a sigh and was, he privately found, one of the more charming sounds he had heard in recent memory. He did not tell her that. He was not a man who moved fast toward things that mattered to him. He had learned, through experience, that the things worth having required a kind of patience that was different from waiting, not passive but deliberate, not holding back but being present at the right speed. October moved into November, and with it came the complications that Pearl had known were coming. The Cassidy family, which in Harrowfield was less a family and more a kind of ongoing weather system, had been watching the water rights situation with the focused attention of men who had always believed the East Creek was theirs by right if not by law. Ned Cassidy was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and had the conviction of a man who had never seriously encountered the word no. His father, old Tom Cassidy, had built the Cassidy cattle operation into the largest in the county through a combination of sharp dealing and the willingness to occupy whatever ground had not been actively defended. The Cassidys owned 3 of the 5 members of the county water board. They did not own Gerald Holt. They leased him, which was a different and more cost-effective arrangement. And they had, Pearl suspected, been waiting for her father's death as a strategic opportunity. The first sign of trouble was a notice from the county clerk's office, delivered to Pearl on a Tuesday morning, informing her that her father's estate was being contested on the grounds that there was a question about the validity of the original homestead claim, dating back to the land grant of 1863. The contesting party was listed as Cassidy Cattle Company. Pearl read the notice standing at her front door in the November morning with frost on the grass, and a feeling in her chest that was anger and fear combined, in the proportions that made them hard to tell apart. She rode to Agnes Colville's house first, because Agnes was the wisest person she knew in practical terms, and because she needed to think aloud at someone who would not panic with her. Agnes read the notice and said, in a tone that meant she was not surprised. "They're contesting the original grant," Pearl said. "They've been waiting for the right moment to do it," Agnes said. "Your father knew. He told me once that the Cassidys had been sniffing around that 1863 grant for years, looking for a crack. As long as Robert was alive and in good health and inclined to fight, it wasn't worth their while. But now I'm alone and still in probate, and the provisional water rights are just that, provisional," Pearl said. "If they can invalidate the original grant, the entire homestead reverts to unassigned territory, and they will apply for it immediately and have the county board approve it within the week. Do you have your father's original land grant documentation?" "I have everything. He kept everything." Pearl looked at her hands. "But a contest like this, Agnes, it goes to the district court. That means a judge from San Antonio, and that means the Cassidys will have had 6 months to cultivate that judge, while I've had 6 months of running a ranch alone and trying to keep 63 longhorns alive through the summer." Agnes poured coffee and set it in front of Pearl with the authority of someone who knows that a hot drink in a crisis is not a solution, but is a real and concrete thing when everything else feels uncertain. "Who is your witness?" she asked. "Your father would have had witnesses to the original grant." Pearl thought about this. "Marcus Webb," she said. "He was there in 1863. He witnessed the staking." "Then get Marcus Webb to put it in writing formally before the Cassidys think to make his life inconvenient," Agnes said. "And you need someone who understands the water law as it relates to the grant validity, because this is not just about property. If they successfully contest the grant, the water rights go with it." Pearl rode home, changed horses to give Biscuit a rest, and then rode west to Daniel Easton's property. She had not intended to come to him with this. She had intended to keep the Cassidy problem separate from the creek work, to not make him feel obligated or entangled in something that was not his fight. But the water rights were attached to the land grant, which meant if the Cassidys succeeded in contesting her father's homestead claim, the shared easement that Daniel had helped her secure at the courthouse meeting would also be voided. His fight and her fight were, in fact, the same fight. She found him working on his barn, replacing boards on the south wall with the focused competence of a man who has rebuilt things before and knows the work as intimately as a language. He heard her horse and turned, and she saw his expression shift when he read hers. "What happened?" he said, coming down from the ladder. She told him about the notice, standing in the yard with the cold November wind pulling at her coat, and she watched him listen the way he always listened, fully, without interruption, with the careful stillness of a man absorbing information before he draws any conclusions. When she finished, he said, "They're moving now because they think the provisional water rights made your position stronger, and they need to undercut it before the county survey in January." "Yes," Pearl said. "If your father's original grant is invalidated, the easement we established at the meeting becomes moot." "Yes," Pearl said again. He looked at her steadily. "Then we address this together," he said, as if it were the simplest and most obvious thing, as if there were no other possible response. Pearl felt something loosen in her chest, the particular tension of a person who has been carrying a weight alone and just been offered a hand. She did not entirely know what to do with that feeling, so she did what she usually did, which was to focus on the practical. "Marcus Webb," she said. "He witnessed the original staking. I need to get his formal testimony documented before they approach him." "I'll ride with you to Marcus Webb's this afternoon," Daniel said. "And I know a lawyer in San Antonio, Martin Delaney. He handled my deed transfer." He's honest and he's thorough and he knows Texas land law as well as anyone practicing. Can he take the case on short notice? I'll write to him today and we'll have an answer by the end of the week. Daniel paused. Pearl, this is solvable. It is complicated and it is the Cassidy's best attempt at causing trouble, but it is solvable. She looked at him. He was standing in his yard in his work clothes with sawdust on his sleeve and a board still in his hand, and he was completely serious and completely calm, and she thought that there was something in that combination of qualities that was, in the particular context of her life in the last 4 months, the most valuable thing she had encountered. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said. "We have the same creek." "That is a remarkably unromantic reason to help someone," she said before she could stop herself. Something happened in his expression, a shift, a warmth, quickly controlled. "There are other reasons," he said, and then he went to put the board down and get his coat, and Pearl stood in the yard with the wind in her hair and the October feeling still unfolding in her chest, and thought that she was going to have an honest conversation with herself quite soon. Marcus Webb was 71 years old and lived on a small property 6 miles south of town, in a house that was slightly too large for one person, and had the particular quiet of a space from which life has gradually retreated. He had been Pearl's father's oldest friend in Harrowfield, and when he opened his door to find Pearl and Daniel on his porch, his face moved through several expressions before settling on something that was welcome and grief and purpose all at once. He remembered the staking of 1863 with perfect clarity, as old men sometimes remember the important moments of their youth while forgetting last Tuesday. He described the day in detail, the location, the witnesses, the county agent who had been present, the exact boundaries as they had been measured. He signed the formal statement that Daniel wrote out in his careful hand, and Pearl witnessed it, and Daniel witnessed it, and Marcus Webb pressed the paper back to Pearl with both hands as if he were handing her something precious. "Your father was afraid they'd do this," he said. "He talked about it once, maybe 2 years before he passed. He said the Cassidys were patient. He said patience in a bad man was the most dangerous quality." "He was right about most things," Pearl said. "He was right about you," Marcus said. "He said you'd hold it, said you were the person he trusted most in the world to do what needed to be done." He looked at Daniel with the clear-eyed assessment of an old man who has earned the right to evaluate people directly. "I'm glad she's got someone standing with her." The ride home in the early dark was quiet in the way of two people who have each privately heard something important and are sitting with it. The stars came out over the Texas plain in the extravagant quantity that only open country and clean air allow, thick and brilliant, and the horses moved through the dark with the confidence of animals who know their way home. "My father was right about most things," Pearl said eventually, to the stars and to the road and to the man riding beside her. "He was wrong about one thing. He thought I would be all right without someone beside me. He thought he had prepared me so well for being alone that I wouldn't feel it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you feel it?" "Yes," Pearl said. "Every day." Another quiet. The horses' hooves on the dry grass, the distant yipping of coyotes to the south, the great star-crowded sky. "I know something about that," Daniel said. "After my father died in Tennessee before I came west. I was alone on that farm for 2 years, and I had convinced myself that I was fine with it. And then I was riding the east fence line one evening in the spring, just after I arrived here, and there was a meadowlark singing somewhere in the grass, and I stopped my horse and I sat there and I thought, there is no one I would tell about this. There is no one to come home to and say, I heard the best thing today. And that was when I understood the difference between being solitary and being lonely." Pearl turned her head and looked at him riding beside her in the dark, and she thought that she had known people her whole life, and she had liked some of them, and respected some of them, and none of them had said a true thing so directly to her since her father died. "There was a meadowlark in my east pasture yesterday," she said. He looked at her. "Singing," she said. "In November, which is late for them. I stopped what I was doing and I listened for a long time. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked back at the road, and Pearl looked back at the road, and both of them let the dark and the stars and the horses carry them home. The letter from Martin Delaney in San Antonio arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Daniel had written. He would take the case. He had dealt with the Cassidy family before, in a water dispute on the county's west side, and he had a great deal to say about them in language that Pearl found both accurate and satisfying. He would need the original deed, the 1863 land grant documentation, Marcus Webb's sworn statement, Pearl's father's rainfall and survey records, and the documentation from the courthouse water rights meeting. Pearl gathered all of it over the course of 2 days, with Daniel helping her catalog and copy each document, so that she would have duplicates in case anything was lost in transit. He came to the ranch for this, sat at her father's kitchen table in the room that still smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and worked through the documents with her with the same thorough patience he brought to everything. It was the first time he had been inside the house, and Pearl watched, without appearing to watch, the way he moved through the space carefully, respectfully, with the awareness of someone who understood that they were in a place that held a great deal of meaning. At one point she went to make coffee and came back to find him standing at the window that looked out over the east pasture, and there was something in his posture that was so still and so attentive that she paused in the doorway. "The grass is holding well," he said, without turning around, "past the east fence line. Your father maintained the grazing rotation." "He had a system," Pearl said. "I've been following it. It shows." He turned from the window. "The land is in good shape, Pearl. Whatever they're trying to claim about the validity of the grant, the land itself testifies to 60-odd years of honest ownership and good stewardship. A judge can see that." "Lawyers see law," Pearl said. "Judges see law. Good lawyers and good judges see evidence," Daniel said. "And evidence lives in the land as much as in the documents." He sat back down at the table and picked up the next page of documentation. "Your father understood that. That's why he kept 15 years of rainfall journals." They worked until the evening, and then Pearl made supper because it was late and they were both still working, and it was simply the practical thing to do. And they ate at the kitchen table among the documents with the lamp between them, and the conversation moved from legal strategy to cattle management to the particular challenges of the January county survey. And then, gradually and without anyone deciding to go there, to Tennessee and the farm that had run down. And to the year Pearl was 16 when her mother died, and she took over the domestic running of the house alongside the ranch work because there was no one else, and to the meadowlark, and to the nature of what made a place home. "I think it is people," Pearl said. "Not the land itself, not the house, people. My father made this house a home. Without him, it is very well documented and full of memories, and I am grateful for every inch of it, but it is quieter than a house should be." Daniel looked at her across the lamp. The light was warm and low, and it made the room feel smaller and more contained, like a world unto itself for the span of an evening. "I think you're right," he said. "My house in Tennessee was never as much a home as this feels, and this isn't even my house." It was said simply, without calculation, but it landed between them with the weight of something significant, and Pearl met his eyes and did not look away. And for a long moment the lamp burned between them and the documents lay on the table, and the house was very quiet. Then congregation in the north pasture produced a sound that was part bellow and part announcement, loud enough to carry to the house. Pearl stood up. "He does that when something's near the fence line," she said, and the moment broke into practical motion, and Daniel stood as well, and they both went to the door. There was nothing at the fence line except the dark, and a cold wind, and congregation standing with his large head lifted, testing the air, which he did occasionally simply because he could. After a moment he lowered his head and went back to whatever a bull thinks about when there is nothing more interesting to do. Pearl and Daniel stood on the porch together in the cold, and the stars were out again and the plain stretched away in every direction in the dark, and their breath made small clouds in the November air. "I should go," Daniel said. "You probably should," Pearl agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Pearl," he said, and then he stopped, and she could feel him making a decision about something. She turned and looked at him directly because she had always been better at direct than at sideways. "Say what you're thinking," she said. He looked at her, and in the starlight she could read his face with the clarity that certain kinds of honesty produce between people. "I think about you," he said. "Not just the shared easement or the legal situation. I think about you. I want to say that plainly so there is no confusion about what I mean." Pearl held his gaze and felt the warmth of that moving through her like the first good coffee of a cold morning, real and immediate and useful. "I know what you mean," she said. "I think about you too. I want to be honest about that." He was quiet for a moment and she could see him working through something. "I don't want to add to the complications of your life," he said. "You have enough of those." "You are not a complication," she said. "You are the one part of the last 3 months that has not been a complication." The expression on his face was something she was going to keep for a long time. Warmth and relief, and something steady underneath that felt like the creek in good weather running clear and honest and not going anywhere. "Then I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once, like a man noting something important in a permanent record, and then he said goodnight and went to get his horse, and Pearl stood on the porch and watched him ride out across the dark plain. And then she went back inside and sat at the table full of documents and her father's rain journals, and she felt, for the first time since August, that the house was not entirely quiet. November became December, and December brought cold and the first hard frosts, and the particular light of winter on the Texas plain that is low and golden and makes everything look like the last frame of something beautiful. Daniel came to call twice a week, and on the weeks when the weather permitted, Pearl rode to his western parcel and they worked together on whatever needed working, the survey preparations, the fence repairs that cold weather always revealed, the management of their respective herds through the thinner grass of winter. They also simply spent time together in the way of two people discovering what another person is, which is an occupation that requires no practical justification and is entirely its own reward. They rode the creek line in the early morning when the frost was still on the grass and talked about everything from the practical to the philosophical, and they read in companionable silence in the evenings, Daniel with whatever technical manual he had ordered and Pearl with the novels she allowed herself in the winter months. And they argued about things worth arguing about and agreed about things without needing to say so. And the whole of it had the quality of something being built, something careful and solid, and intended to last. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening on the porch of the Langley ranch house, with the last of the sunset going amber and violet behind the plain, and it was deliberate and warm and exactly right, and Pearl thought that her father, who had always known her truest nature, would have approved. The legal situation with the Cassidys moved through December and into the new year with the slow, grinding momentum of frontier litigation, which was to say it was expensive in terms of anxiety and paperwork and occasional late-night worry, but was progressing in the right direction. Martin Delaney was a precise and methodical man who wrote long letters full of legal detail that Pearl read carefully and discussed with Daniel, and his assessment as the months turned was increasingly confident. The 1863 land grant was clean. Marcus Webb's sworn statement was solid. The Cassidys' contest rested on a single ambiguous phrase in the original grant description, which Delaney had traced to a surveyor's abbreviation that had been misread, and which he had now correctly interpreted with 3 supporting references from period documentation. January brought the county survey, and Pearl was there for it with her documents and her survey notes, and the 3 flagged points on the creek line. The county surveyor, a taciturn man named Holland who appeared to care about precision more than politics, spent 2 full days on the East Creek and the western parcel, and produced a formal survey that confirmed the original boundary measurements within a margin of acceptable variance. The provisional water rights became permanent. Gerald Holt was not present for the survey. Pearl heard later that he had taken ill, which Agnes Colville received with a degree of skepticism that Pearl shared. In February, Martin Delaney wrote to inform Pearl that the district judge in San Antonio had reviewed the Cassidy contest and found it without merit. The Langley homestead deed was valid and uncontested. The estate probate was proceeding normally and would be complete within 60 days. Pearl read the letter sitting at her father's kitchen table with the February light coming through the window and the creek outside and the sound of cattle in the north pasture, and the particular deep quiet of a thing that has been resolved. She read it twice, and then she sat for a while with her hands flat on the table, feeling the texture of the wood under her palms, the solidity of it. Then she put on her coat and went outside and rode to Daniel's western parcel, and when she arrived he was working with his horses in the yard, and he took one look at her face and he knew. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. "The homestead is mine. The water rights are permanent. The Cassidy contest has been dismissed." He crossed the yard to her horse, and she swung down from the saddle, and he caught her hand as she landed and did not let go of it. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I know," she said, and she felt it, the grief and the triumph together, inseparable, as they so often are when the important things happen. They stood in the February yard with the cold and the clean sky and the sound of the horses, and Daniel held her hand and she held his, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because some things exist in the space before words, and that space is sometimes the truest place. Spring came on gradually, the way it does in the Texas plain, not all at once but in increments. A warm day between cold ones, the grass greening up from the south, the creek running fuller on the spring rains. The Langley ranch came fully into Pearl's name on the 15th of March, 1879, when the county clerk's office formally completed the transfer, and Pearl rode into Harrowfield to collect the new deed with her own name on it. She stopped at the courthouse on her way out of town, purely because she wanted to walk past Gerald Holt, which she did, with the deed in her coat and her father's hat on her head, and a look on her face that said everything she did not need to say aloud. Holt was behind a desk inside the front office, and he saw her through the window as she passed, and he looked away first. Pearl allowed herself one moment of satisfaction, and then got on biscuit and rode home. Daniel came to supper that evening, and she made roasted beef and cornbread and a pie with the last of the stored apples, and they ate at the kitchen table that had held so many documents over the winter, now clear of everything but the food and the lamp and the deed propped against the wall where Pearl had put it so she could look at it while she cooked. After supper they sat on the porch with coffee and the early spring evening around them, the plain going gold and the creek audible from the east, a sound Pearl had heard her whole life, and which had never sounded better than it did that night. "I want to ask you something," Daniel said. Pearl looked at him. He had the expression of a man who has been thinking carefully about how to say a thing and has decided that the preparation matters less than the sincerity. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the creek or the water rights or the legal situation, which are all resolved now and need no romantic scaffolding. Because you are the person I want to come home to. Because you are the person I would tell about the meadowlark. Because I have been thinking about you every day for 6 months, and I expect to go on doing so for considerably longer than that, and I would rather do it as your husband than as your neighbor." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had walked back out of a courthouse door because he had seen an injustice and could not ignore it, who had held a door open without making it a performance, who had sat at her father's table and treated old papers with reverence, who had ridden with her in the dark and said true things, who had held her hand in a February yard when the hard thing was finally finished. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed, that genuine, open laugh that she had loved since the first time she heard it at the creek bank, and he leaned forward and kissed her, and the spring evening held them in it, and the plain stretched away in every direction full of grass and sky, and the quiet, persistent sound of the creek. They were married on the second Saturday in April, 1879, in the small church on the north end of Harrowfield that Pearl had attended her whole life. Agnes Colville stood beside Pearl as her witness, in her best dress, with the erect bearing of a woman who has seen much and holds none of it against the world. Marcus Webb came, older and slower, but with the particular brightness of a man who has lived long enough to see good things conclude well. There were other people Pearl had known all her life, neighbors and their families, people who had respected her father, and some who had been uncertain about her, and a few who had been outright opposed, and were now present out of a combination of social obligation and the quiet human instinct toward good outcomes. Gerald Holt was not invited and did not attend. The Cassidy family sent no representative, which was a gift of absence that Pearl received without comment. The minister, a gentle man named Reverend Cole, who had known Pearl since she was 12 and attending her mother's funeral in this same church, married them with the brevity and sincerity of a man who has performed many ceremonies and understands that the words belong to the two people saying them, not to the person reciting them. Daniel said his vows looking at Pearl with the steady, unhurried attention she had come to understand as fundamental to who he was, not dramatic, not performative, simply fully present, fully true. Pearl said hers looking back at him with the clarity that she had always brought to things that mattered, and she meant every word in the way of a person who does not use words lightly. When it was done and they were walking out of the church into the April sunshine, Agnes Colville pressed Pearl's hand and said, "Your mother would have liked him very much." Pearl smiled and said, "She would have told him he needed a haircut." Agnes laughed, a real laugh, the kind Pearl hadn't heard from her in some time, and it added itself to the afternoon like a gift. The spring of 1879 was a good one in Harrowfield County, and a good one specifically on the combined operations of the Langley homestead and Daniel Easton's western parcel, which they ran as separate legal entities, but in practical terms as a single, coordinated enterprise. They were two ranches that shared a creek, a philosophical approach to land management, a kitchen table where plans were made and changed and argued over, and as the spring turned toward summer, a home. Daniel moved into the Langley ranch house because it was larger and better established, and because Pearl said plainly that she was not going to leave her father's land, and because Daniel was a man who understood the difference between pragmatism and compromise. He brought his books and his technical manuals and his two horses, including the spiritually ambitious one, whose name was Argument, and who proved to have opinions about the Langley property that were only slightly less comprehensive than Congregation's. The two animals eyeing each other across the fence line in the first week of cohabitation was a sight that Pearl and Daniel stood at the kitchen window and watched together with the deep, wordless entertainment of two people beginning a shared life. "They'll sort it out," Daniel said. "Congregation always sorts things out on his own terms," Pearl said. "Then Argument is going to have a formative experience," Daniel said, and Pearl leaned into his shoulder and laughed. They worked hard through the spring and summer, as all ranch people do, but they worked it together, which made the difference between work as endurance and work as something chosen. Pearl's herd grew to 80 longhorns with a strong calf crop that summer. Daniel sold his first significant lot of cattle at fair market price, and used the proceeds to repair the western parcel's main barn and purchase 2 additional horses. The creek held through the summer, running lower in July as always but maintaining enough flow to sustain both operations, and the permanent water rights that had been secured through the winter's legal battle proved their worth in August when the neighboring properties that had not secured easements were in difficulty. Ned Cassidy lost 40 head that summer to a water shortage on his eastern range, which his own creek, unprotected by any formal rights, had refused to support in the dry months. There were people in Harrowfield who found this satisfying and said so, and there were people who considered it unkind to find it satisfying and kept quiet about doing so anyway. Pearl found herself thinking, when she heard about it, of her father's phrase, "This must be protected." He had not protected it out of spite toward the Cassidys. He had protected it because good land and honest water rights were worth protecting for their own sake, and because a woman who knew the law was harder to cheat than one who didn't, and because he had planned for everything he could plan for. She missed him. She thought she would always miss him. But she had the sense, in the way of people who have been genuinely known by a parent, that he would have looked at her life now, the deed in her name, the creek secured, the man at her table, the herd growing, the house full of the sounds of a life shared, and he would have looked at it and nodded, the way he nodded when a thing had been done properly. In October of 1879, Pearl told Daniel she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the October light coming through the window at its low and golden angle, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that ended in a kind of joyful astonishment that made him look, just briefly, younger than his 32 years. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her as if she was every good thing that had ever happened to him, and she looked back at him and felt it exactly reciprocated, and the kitchen was full of the October light and the sound of the creek and the smell of coffee, and everything in it was exactly right. "Boy or girl," he said, "that child is going to know every inch of this land." "And the law governing it," Pearl said. "And the meadowlarks," Daniel said. "And the meadowlarks," Pearl agreed. Their son was born in the late spring of 1880, on a June evening when the plain was green and the creek was running full, and the air smelled of rain and grass. They named him Robert, after Pearl's father, which had never been in question. He came into the world in the particular way that all new things come into it with struggle and difficulty, and then suddenly, breathtakingly, being present. And Daniel held him with the careful, overwhelmed reverence of a man holding the most valuable thing he has ever held. And Pearl, exhausted and elated and more completely herself than she had ever been, watched her husband hold her son, and thought that some things are worth more than language has yet found to express them. Agnes Colville came the next morning and sat in the kitchen and held Robert and said he had his grandfather's hands, which made Pearl cry in the good and necessary way of someone releasing something that had been held for a long time. Marcus Webb came the following week, moving slowly on his old legs but with his eyes bright and clear, and he held the baby and said, "Robert Langley's grandson. That's a good thing. That's a very good thing." And Pearl thought it was, without qualification, exactly that. The summer of 1880 was busy in the deep and satisfying way that life with a new child is busy, organized around small and enormous things simultaneously. The management of a ranch and the management of a new person who has no interest in the ranch's schedule. Daniel and Pearl divided and adapted and rearranged, and found the rhythm that works for two capable people facing something that requires more than either of them alone. Robert grew through that summer and into the fall with the particular enthusiasm of a healthy child, and Daniel took to fatherhood with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, completely, patiently, and with a quality of joy that Pearl had not quite anticipated and found more moving than she could easily say. She would come in from morning work and find them in the kitchen together, Daniel with the baby on his knee, talking to him in the quiet, serious way he talked about things he cared about, as if Robert were fully capable of understanding every word, and it was simply a matter of time before he demonstrated this. And maybe he was right, Pearl thought, watching them. Robert had his grandfather's hands and his father's attentive eyes, and what looked like his mother's chin set at an angle that suggested opinions were forming. The Cassidy situation resolved itself quietly in the fall of 1880. Old Tom Cassidy died in September, and with his death something went out of the enterprise, the central conviction, perhaps, that the world owed the Cassidys whatever they had not yet taken. Ned Cassidy sold the eastern range that had failed in the summer drought and contracted his operation considerably. And without the money or the ambition to pursue county politics, Gerald Holt found himself employed directly by the county in a reduced capacity that involved no doorways and no decisions about who could enter them. Pearl heard about these developments through Agnes and through the General Intelligence Network of Harrowfield, which continued to operate with its customary efficiency. She received each piece of news without satisfaction or vindictiveness, which was something her father had also modeled, not indifference to outcomes, but the absence of appetite for an enemy's suffering. The land was hers. The water rights were secured. That was the whole of what had been needed. By the spring of 1881, the Langley Easton operation, which was what people in the county had begun to call it, combining the names in the way that communities do when two things have become one thing, was regarded as one of the soundest ranching enterprises in Harrowfield County. The creek was maintained, the herd was healthy and growing, the western parcel had been developed into productive pasture, and the two people at the center of it had the reputation of being both extremely capable and difficult to cheat, which in 1881 Texas was a form of honor. Pearl was 27 that spring, and Robert was nearly a year old and pulling himself upright on the furniture with the fierce determination of someone who has decided that the distance between the floor and everything interesting is a problem to be solved immediately. Daniel watched him one evening in March, the boy standing against the kitchen table leg with his legs shaking and his face set in absolute concentration, and said, "He has your stubbornness. He has your patience," Pearl said. "He's been working on that table leg for 20 minutes without giving up. Those are different things." "They are, and he has both of them," Pearl said. "He is going to be impossible." "He is going to be magnificent," Daniel said. And Robert, as if in agreement, let go of the table leg and stood for 3 entirely unsupported seconds before sitting down hard on the kitchen floor and looking up at them both with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. They both moved toward him instinctively, simultaneously, from opposite sides of the kitchen, and arrived at the same moment, kneeling on the floor beside their son, and looked at each other over his head, with the shared recognition that no amount of preparation or planning or good documentation entirely prepares you for the specific joy of this moment. This child, this person who did not exist a year ago and is already entirely himself. Pearl's second pregnancy was confirmed in the summer of 1881, and she received the news with the particular combination of happiness and logistical calculation that is unique to someone who runs a ranch and knows exactly what the timing will mean for the fall cattle work. Daniel received it with pure and uncomplicated delight, and the contrast was both fair and typical. Agnes Colville came to supper in August and brought a cake, which was her way of marking occasions, and she sat at the kitchen table with Robert on her knee and said, "Your father would have wanted this for you. He worried, you know. After your mother died, he always worried about who would be here for you." Pearl looked at her husband across the table, who was cutting cake with the domestic ease of a man who has made himself at home in a kitchen that was not originally his, and who looked up at that moment and met her eyes with the warm, clear attention that she knew was the most reliable thing in her world. "Tell him not to worry," Pearl said. Agnes patted Robert's round knee and said, "I think he knows." Their second child was a girl, born in the early spring of 1882, in the same house, and with the same practical assistance that Robert had arrived with Agnes Colville, managing the proceedings with the authority of someone who has seen most things and is not alarmed by any of them. She was named Clara, after Pearl's mother, which was another decision that had never been in question, and she arrived into the world with dark hair and eyes that in the first days were the indeterminate blue of all new babies, but that within 3 weeks had settled into the creekwater color gray-green stormlight that Pearl saw in her own mirror every morning. "She looks like you," Daniel said, in the voice of a man who considers this a remarkable and very good thing. "She looks like herself," Pearl said, which was also true. Clara had opinions from the first week and expressed them without hesitation, which Agnes said was entirely characteristic of the Langley line. Robert, for his part, regarded his sister with the initial suspicion of a 22-month-old who has had exclusive claim on a situation and now finds it altered. And then, within a week, with the protective ownership of someone who has decided that this small person belongs to him and he will be responsible for her. He brought her things: a wooden horse, a dried grass stalk, a river stone he was particularly attached to, and placed them carefully beside her as gifts or as markers of territory. Pearl could not always tell which, and the whole of it was so entirely its own kind of joy that she had to sometimes stop in the middle of work and simply feel it, the weight and texture of a life that was full. The homestead was alive with it by that spring, the creek running, the herd building, the children growing, the two people who had begun as strangers at a courthouse door grown into each other so thoroughly that the house itself seemed to have reorganized itself around the fact of them, as houses do when they become truly inhabited. Pearl walked the east pasture on a morning in April, early, before anyone else was awake, in the way she had always walked it, attentively, reading the grass and the fence lines and the water and the sky with the practiced eye of someone who learned this land as a child and has carried it in her body ever since. The morning was clear and cold with spring in it, the dew still on the grass, the light coming in from the east at an angle that made everything look newly placed, and she heard from somewhere near the south fence a meadowlark singing. She stopped and listened. The song was clear and complicated, full of intervals and repetitions that were familiar and new at once, the way the best things are, and she stood in the April morning with her coat around her and the creek audible to the east and the meadowlark singing somewhere in the south grass, and she thought about what her father had written at the top of certain pages. This must be protected. She had protected it. The deed was in her name. The water rights were permanent. The land was in good grass and honest use, and the cattle on it were healthy and multiplying, and the well worked reliably now that Daniel had rebuilt the casing in the winter of their first year together. And in the house behind her, her husband and her children were beginning to wake to the morning. She thought about a man walking back out of a courthouse door, because he had seen a woman barred from something that was rightfully hers, and the specific quality of decision in that act, the simple and complete refusal to go in without her. She had thought about it many times over the years, had turned it over in her mind the way you turn a good stone, not obsessively but with recurring appreciation for the particular truth of it. He had not made a speech. He had not appointed himself her champion. He had simply stopped at the door, done the arithmetic, and walked back out and said he would not go in without her. It was the truest thing she had seen a person do in a long time, and she had been watching closely for such things because her father had taught her to look for them. Not grand gestures, which were easily performed and just as easily withdrawn, but the small, definitive acts that told you who a person actually was, where their compass actually pointed when it was not being watched. She turned and walked back toward the house, and the meadowlark was still singing somewhere in the south pasture, and the creek was running, and the April morning was doing what April mornings do, which is offer the world back to itself, new and full of possibility. Daniel was in the kitchen when she came in, with Robert on his hip and Clara in the cradle by the stove that he had built specifically for this purpose in February, close enough to the warmth but not too close, positioned where she could be seen from anywhere in the room. He was making coffee with the one free hand of a man who has learned to do most things with a child attached to him, and Robert was watching the coffee pot with the focused attention of someone who has decided that understanding how things work is the most important occupation in the world. He looked up when Pearl came in, and the look on his face was the same one she had seen since the beginning, warm, steady, entirely present, but layered now with everything that had happened in the years between. The legal battles and the winter survey and the spring wedding and the children and the 1,000 ordinary days that were the actual substance of a life. "Meadowlark," she said. "Yes," he said with the slight smile of a man who remembers. "In the south pasture, singing." He set the coffee down and looked at her across the kitchen with Robert on his hip and Clara in the cradle and the morning coming through the window. "I want to hear about that," he said. Pearl took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, her father's hat on the hook beside it where it always was, where it always would be. "You will," she said. "I'll tell you everything." And she did, at the kitchen table with the coffee between them and the children in their various states of morning readiness, and the land outside in its April green, and the creek running east, and the whole of the day opening ahead of them. Ordinary and extraordinary and completely, entirely, irrevocably theirs. In the years that followed, Harrowfield grew the way frontier towns grow in fits and starts, gaining a school and a doctor's office and a second church, and losing them again to time and economics and the decisions of people who moved on, and then gaining them again with a new generation. The Langley Easton operation became one of the fixed points in the county's geography, the kind of place that people referred to as an example of what the land could be with proper stewardship and honest work. Visitors to the county, surveyors and buyers and occasionally journalists writing about the development of the Texas range, were sometimes directed to the East Creek properties as an illustration of how water rights and land management could be made to work together rather than against each other. Pearl always received these visitors at the kitchen table with the same directness she had brought to everything from the day. She walked up the courthouse steps with her father's deed inside her coat and her father's hat on her head. She talked about the water rights documentation with the fluency of a woman who had spent years learning the law, and about the land with the intimacy of someone who had grown up on it, and about the practical details of running cattle through the dry years with the authority of someone who had done it and continued to do it. Daniel was usually in the background during these conversations, managing the ranch work or the children or both simultaneously, and she noticed that visitors sometimes seemed surprised by this, by the man who was clearly the co-architect of everything they were seeing, and yet who was entirely comfortable allowing the woman at the table to be the voice of it, as naturally and as completely as if there were no other possible arrangement, which, for him, there wasn't. It had never been a decision he had made or a generosity he had chosen. It was simply accurate. This was Pearl's land, Pearl's deed, Pearl's father's careful documentation, Pearl's knowledge of the law and the water and the grass. He had brought his 300 acres and his Tennessee patience and his unwillingness to walk through a door that was being held closed behind an injustice, and all of those things were real and his own. But the East Creek and the Langley homestead were hers, and he was a man who understood that the most important thing about a thing you loved was getting it right. Robert grew into a boy who was exactly what Pearl had predicted in those early years, impossible in the way of someone who is thorough, questions everything, and refuses to accept an answer that is not accurate. He was, by the time he was 8, the most knowledgeable person in the household regarding the locations of every survey stake on both properties, and he had developed an interest in water engineering that Daniel encouraged with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything his children were genuinely interested in, which was unconditional and practically expressed. Clara grew into a girl who had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet humor and an independence of temperament that was entirely her own. She had opinions and expressed them in complete sentences without apology, and she had a way with animals that was something close to communication, a gift that appeared without explanation and was accepted without one. Marcus Webb passed in the autumn of 1883, peacefully in his own house, at 74 years old. Pearl went to his burial and stood beside his grave on the hill above town and thought of him saying, "Robert Langley's grandson. That's a good thing." She thought it was still a good thing, and that the chain of good things that connected Marcus Webb to her father, to Pearl, to Robert, to Daniel, to the children, ran through the years like the creek ran through the land, continuous, sometimes diminished, sometimes full, but not stopping. Agnes Colville remained as she had always been, fixed, practical, wise, and possessed of a quality of endurance that Pearl had always admired and tried to emulate. She came to Sunday suppers and held the children and said things at the kitchen table that were always worth hearing, and Pearl loved her as she loved few people in the world, fully and without reservation, and with the knowledge of someone who understood what it was to have a person who simply, reliably, stayed. And Daniel Easton, who had walked out of a courthouse door and held it open and stood beside her through everything that followed, who had sat at her father's table and treated the old papers with reverence, who had ridden in the dark and said true things, who had held her hand in a February yard when the hard thing was finished, who had said the word marriage as if it were the simplest and most obvious destination in the world. He was still that man. He was more than that man, in the way that a person becomes more of themselves when they are known completely and loved for it. He was the man at the kitchen table with the coffee and the children and the technical manuals and the dry humor that had deepened over the years into something rich and layered. And he was the man who still rode out to the creek line in the early mornings just to check the water, and who still stopped sometimes and listened when the meadowlarks were singing in the south pasture, and who still came home and told her about it. On a morning in the spring of 1885, Pearl Langley Easton walked the east pasture at dawn as she had done most mornings of her adult life, in the particular light that she had watched since childhood and understood the way you understand something you have been in close relationship with for a long time. The grass was green and the creek was running full on the spring rains, and the cattle were in the north pasture, and the survey stakes along the boundary were where they should be, and the whole of the land was exactly as it should be, established and protected and in honest use. The deed to 240 acres was in her name. The water rights were permanent and documented. The herd had grown to 140 head. The children were in the house behind her, awake and probably making breakfast with varying degrees of success. Her husband was checking the creek line to the south, which she knew because she had heard his horse head that direction at first light. She stood at the fence line in the April morning and breathed the air that was cold and green, and carried the particular smell of the Texas plain in spring, and she thought of everything that had led to this morning, every document and legal battle and cold courthouse step, and dark winter ride, and meadowlark and creek survey, and lamplit kitchen table conversation, and small fierce joy that had accumulated into the weight and texture of a life that was complete. This must be protected. It had been. It was. And the morning stretched ahead of her into a day that would be full of work and noise and the particular requirements of a life that was bigger than any one person, and built on the labor of more than one pair of hands. And she was grateful for all of it, for the struggle that had produced it, for the man who had held the door, for the father who had taught her the law, for the creek that ran east. She heard Daniel's horse coming back along the fence line from the south, and she turned and watched him ride toward her through the spring morning, and when he was close enough to see her face clearly, he raised his hand in the small, private greeting that was theirs alone, not a wave, something quieter, a recognition, and she raised hers back. He rode up and stopped beside her and looked at the pasture and the creek and the morning the same way she had been looking at it, with the shared literacy of two people who have spent years reading the same landscape together. "Creek's full," he said. "I heard it from the house," she said. "South stake is solid, no erosion from the winter. Good." A pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "Robert tried to make hotcakes," Daniel said. "How did that go?" "Enthusiastically," he said, and she laughed, and the morning held it. They stood together at the fence line in the April spring with their land around them, and the creek running, and the children in the house behind them, and 40 years of work and love and seasons still ahead of them stretching out over the plain like the plain itself. enormous and clear and full of weather, full of the particular wild beauty of a place where you know every inch of the ground and the ground knows you back. Pearl looked at Daniel. He looked at her. "Come on," she said. "Let's go check on those hotcakes." They turned their horses toward home, side by side across the April grass, and the meadowlark was singing somewhere in the south pasture, and the creek ran east, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.